Hi, everybody. Welcome to this video, webinar on authenticity, true self or truly selfish. Myself and Dan are here, and in the background is Angela, who will help with questions and chat and everything like that. So we're gonna. I'm Nick Marks, and this is Dan, and we're going to introduce ourselves first of all, and then we're going to talk about what we and actually what you think authenticity is. So it would be great if you have a think about what you think authenticity is, or what issues you've got with it, because we're going to try and run this quite involve your comments and everything in it in this. Dan and I started this conversation really because we both sort of had grumblings about authenticity and what it is and what it isn't, and has it got devalued. And so Dan's going to start by sort of outlining some of his issues with authenticity, and going to come to your favorite definition, I think, aren't you, Dan? Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, and then I'm going to talk about authentic self or selves. Like when we say authentic self, do we have a self, other selves? And a bit about the tension between safety and freedom, which some of you may have read my blog last week, which is where I ended up with when I started thinking about this more deeply. And then some practical ideas from Dan and questions and reflections. So I'll stop sharing my screen at the moment, and perhaps Dan, you can start by introducing yourself.
Thank you, Nick. What a great setup. Thank you for all coming this morning and involving yourselves in this ongoing deliberative topic that Nick and I have been batting around for months now. I couldn't have said it better, that there's some grumblings here. So we hope that's a little enticing and evocative, that we have some grumblings with a word that's used very broadly in leadership development. But to properly introduce myself, my name is Dan Stover. I'm the founder and CEO of Ensight Partners. We do executive leadership development, senior leader development, specializing in the psychological sciences. Emotional intelligence is a common phrasing, often doing that through executive coaching, team consultation, assessments, and training, stuff you're all familiar with, I'm sure. We're based in Los Angeles, but we work all around the world. Our connections led us to Friday Pulse and Nick's wonderful company, and have a deep love, collegial love for Nick and what he's doing at Friday Pulse and his thought leadership on happiness. So Nick, I would love to hand it over to you to properly introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks. And what's the weather like today in LA? Because in the UK it's pretty grey.
We had UK weather yesterday. We had much needed fog and rain and mist, and today's nice and clear. Back to Southern California weather.
Actually, I'm a bit unfair. The sun has come out today, but it rained on me most of this week. So for those who don't know me, I'm Nick Marks, the founder and creator of Friday Pulse. I am a statistician by trade. That's my sort of core skill in a way. I also trained as a therapist when I was young, and I worked on organizational change, group change, done a master's on that too. So I come at happiness from a slightly empirical way, but also from a very inquiring way. So and across today, I guess we'll both be drawing on those two parts. So we'd love to hear from you. So basically, what do you think authenticity is, or what's your issue with authenticity? And if you could just put that in the chat, that would be great. If you want to say where you're from, that would be good too. I'm based in Salisbury, quite near Stonehenge. So, the inner druid in me is very happy about living in this area of the world. But if you could put that in the chat, then we're basically, Dan's going to start by just feels fake at times as the first comment I'm seeing there, and I think that's absolutely one of our things. But Dan, perhaps you could start off with your grumbling take on authenticity, and then we'll pick up some of the comments from there.
Sure, I would love to. So you all, during the pandemic, I'm sure you all found something interesting to dive into out of sheer boredom and extra time on your hands. And a little backstory to how I ended up having some grumblings with the word authenticity is learning about a new linguistic phrase. And if any of you on this call know me already, you've probably heard me say the linguistic phrase I learned, which is semantic bleaching. And semantic bleaching is the idea that in a society, semantic bleaching would be the colloquial overuse of a word in everyday conversation out of context so frequently that it loses its original meaning. It loses its core meaning. And I started thinking about all of the different words, particularly in American society, which I've been interested in Nick's thoughts about what's happening in the UK and Europe that's similar. But authenticity is one of the first that came to mind. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. I used to work for someone and was mentored by someone that was kind of famous for saying, authenticity is like beauty. It's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. Now, the paradox here is that that person used authenticity as kind of a means to say whatever was on their mind, kind of unfiltered. And I grabbed a hold of this idea and started realizing how much I was seeing that, particularly in the United States, where authenticity is used as a bit of a cover for, I'm going to tell you whatever I may think or whatever I may feel, and I have license to do so as a result of authenticity. So I'm really interested in some of the chat here, just to pause myself. Authenticity is about being true to who you are and being able to express that in a safe environment. I love the qualification around that, Belinda. I do like the feels fake at times. Variable between people. I think that's something we'll talk about a good bit today in questioning the concept of self. So if you've ever deliberated on consciousness and who you really are, I think you'll be satisfied by some of what Nick and I have to say. I'll briefly share a little more of the problem statement here that I think Nick will talk about in just a bit more detail. So let me pull up these slides here. So here's a little more beyond the semantic bleaching idea that led to this conversation today. Some issues that we have. This idea that authenticity is being true to yourself. Well, if we are thinking deeply about this, you have many selves. There are many roles in your life requiring different versions of who you are. So how can you be true to something that needs to adapt? And there's a bit of a paradox here between this kind of common idea that maybe you've personally experienced or maybe experienced in other people, that our self is static and we need to be true to that static fixed version of who we are. But in reality, who we may be while we're doing business intelligence and data analysis on right left-wing propaganda on Twitter, which is a real thing I saw Scott Galloway post this morning, is probably a different version of you that you are being true to in your data analysis and objective logical reasoning than when you're maybe playing Frisbee with your adolescent child in the front yard. That's a different version of you. So who are you being true to? Therefore, what are you being authentic to? As I mentioned, one of the common colloquial definitions of authenticity is speaking or acting in accordance with your thoughts and feelings. Well, your thoughts and feelings are often reactionary, often unfounded or unproven, just by simply being in a stream of consciousness. And if you've ever sat to meditate for any period of time, 5 minutes or longer, you know that your thoughts are very unpredictable, seemingly coming from nowhere, arising in our consciousness. So imagine a human being being authentic in this definition, constantly expressing their stream of consciousness. You could not possibly interact in a society or get anything done. So who are you being true to if it's about your thoughts and feelings that's in question? And then finally, maintaining strict coherence to your values-based choices. What I think Nick and I have seen in our consulting work in many different companies all around the world is that you can lose your situational awareness quite quickly if you are imposing your value system in a narrow window onto a situation. Now, when it comes to words like, say, integrity and good faith, of course, that's kind of a broad window to look at most situations in life, but it can get quite narrow very quickly, especially if authenticity is one of the core value-based systems to which you're trying to operate in the world at large. But the point here is similar to being true to yourself as kind of a static idea. There's a risk of you losing your situational awareness. So what does this all come down to? It comes down to, who are we? Who are we being true to, and in what context? So I'll share this just very briefly. When I woke up this morning and I was preparing for this, my fiance and I were having coffee together, and I asked her, what do you think authenticity is? And I wrote down what she said, which may lead somewhere this morning and we may not, but it was so endearing that I wanted to share it with you. She said, my highest self is showing up as the big-hearted me underneath all of the layers of hurt. And I was stunned by that. So who is that then? Who does she think she is on an ongoing day-to-day basis if there's a version of her that is layered and a version of her that is big-hearted underneath? So I'll come back to explore this a little more. I'll stop sharing my screen, and Nick, I would love to hear some of your thoughts on both the issues and your deliberations on freedom and safety.
Yes. And I'm going to just go back to the chat for a bit now. So Nuno is there from Portugal. Hi, Nuno. We know each other. He wanted to remind us that Portugal won 6-1 last night. They dropped their authentic self of oh my God, I've forgotten his name now. But your best player who got put on the bench. Anyway, and they still won 6-1, so that was very good, actually. I don't think he's been very authentic recently. Ronaldo, that's it, Nuno. I don't know when I was thinking Ricardo, because I've just spoken to Ricardo, who you know from the same course I was teaching you on, Nuno. So anyway, so Ricardo is the man. Not Ricardo, Ronaldo, of course it is. But also saying that authenticity is about being honest to your values, whatever the situation is. And Max, appropriately adapting to the situation at hand while staying true to yourself. Hi from Ohio. Claire from Buckinghamshire, closer to home for me, home counties. That's what I consider myself, a home counties boy, born in Essex, mainly lived in Berkshire. Anyway, being true to our core values, but flexing with the boundaries of who we are with and where we are. Yeah. And then Anne is saying, there's a core set, I think a core set of values despite the range of selves, but I agree situations can make us adapt at times, which means we're not always true to ourselves. Cold and crispy Birmingham. I wanted to talk about this about selves in that I want to start with a story that I was told by someone during lockdown, and he, like all of us, is working at home. I still am working at home mainly, and he has a 7-year-old daughter, and he would come out of his office. I don't know if it was his bedroom. My office in the first lockdown was in the bedroom, and he'd walk out into the kitchen to make some coffee, and he was in work mode. And he's there with his sort of work hat on, and he comes in, and his daughter's there, and she doesn't know who this daddy is. Who's this daddy that isn't fun? And of course, one of the things that we do, and we used to do, particularly the commute to work allowed us to do, was to change personas from home to work. So can we be our authentic work self, and is that different than our authentic home self? And I think we all know that we do move between, different ways of interacting and being with people in different situations. And this would go right to the core of sort of subpersonalities. If people know about subpersonalities, I think Angela put one link to just the wiki page on subpersonalities. But the idea of subpersonalities is that we have different parts of ourselves. So your fiance, what's her name, Dan?
Her name is Jules.
Jules. So Jules, when she's saying about, my highest self with a big heart underneath the layers of hurt, that the way that subpersonality theory works is that we have different sort of core qualities to ourselves that we're trying to express, and then they can get distorted by our hurt. And they become, and in some ways, we can move between them, but they can sometimes be pure and sometimes they can be distorted by our hurt. But at the core of it is, in a way, her big-heartedness. Though it could be my big determinedness, or my big brilliance, or my big whatever. But there's big parts of ourselves, and we try and express them, and it might be that they're appropriate in different settings. So I think this context to self is very important, in that we're not just one self. We evolve through our lifetimes. I'm quite a different Nick now. I'm in my I think I have to say late 50s now. I'm 58. Can't say mid 50s anymore. My late 50s. I'm very different than I was in my mid 20s. And yet I am similar, but I am different. And so ourselves are evolving, and we have different contexts that we play in. And certainly very many of us have a professional self and a personal self, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But then there comes to this whole bit about unfilteredness. So are people saying authentic self? One of the places we started in our debate was, is it just an opportunity to be unfiltered? And if we look at the horrendous cultures that we still have in some organizations. So in the UK recently, we've had scandals around the fire service, the Metropolitan Police. Our government. There's sort of masses of MPs. I think it's over 50 MPs are under investigation for sexual misconduct. It's like, this is are they might think, oh, I'm being my authentic self, expressing myself, but it's clearly inappropriate if it affects. Someone said at the beginning, it's about being ourselves and respecting the safety of others. I couldn't agree more, that actually the context that we are in is massively important. So authenticity can't just be, I am my authentic self, and my authentic self is racist, misogynist, disrespectful. Actually, we don't want that self at work. I don't really want you to have it in your private life, but you're definitely not bringing it to work. Yeah. And so what are the boundaries on it? And when we talk about values, whose values are there? I think that, at work, we have certain values. And actually, I think this is one of the places that work leads in, is respect, diversity, respecting people from other cultures, from other backgrounds, neurodiversity, respecting that. One of the extraordinary things about work is we get to meet people who are quite different than our normal social circles. And we actually have to find new ways of interacting with people. We can't be in a little bubble of, people just like us. We have to speak with very different people. It's one of the things I love about working, is that you get to meet different people. I get to work with people much younger than me, brighter than me in all sorts of ways, or different skills to me, and that's what keeps you fresh and learning. So I don't buy into the idea that there's one self, and we can go down a few routes with that, one of which could be Daniel Kahneman in his great book, Thinking Slow, Thinking Fast, but actually that builds on work earlier, which is that we have, he says, two selves, which is an experiencing self and a remembering self. An experiencing self is always in the moment. The remembering self is the one that lays down memories. They can be at odds, and that basically memories are distorted through our lenses. Experience, is also distorted through our anxieties or whatever, but they're different types of people. And that's very interesting. But the person who I really want to talk about is a neuroscientist called Anil Seth. And some of you may have seen his TED Talk, and he's written a great book called Being You. But in that, what he's basically talking about is, what is yourself from a neuroscience perspective? And he comes up with this extraordinary phrase, which is very provocative, which is that our self is a stable hallucination. and what he's basically saying is that obviously that our sense of self is there to help us survive and thrive from an evolutionary perspective. But he also talks a lot, but he talks about how we're making a best guess about who we are. So when you were saying earlier, Dan, that, sometimes, when you meditate and you see the randomness of your thoughts, or you're horrified by some of your thoughts, sometimes even, then basically, we notice that we're thinking things were unexpected to us. So who's in control here? And Anil Seth very smartly declares there are 5 selves, and I think there's particularly 2 that are very interesting to us in this context. But his 5 selves are: one is a bodily self, we experience ourselves in our bodily, so that's one. Number 2 is what he calls the perceiving self, which is the sense that we look out from these eyes to the world. It's sort of located almost where the third eye, Hindus would say the third eye is, but we're looking out into the world and we perceive the world. That's the second self. The third self is the volitional self, the one that chooses. And actually, we have a feeling that we choose to do things. So into behavior then. So that becomes quite interesting in this context. The fourth one is the narrative self. This is so the perceiving self is like Kahneman's experiencing self. The fourth one is the narrative self, which is the stories we tell about ourselves. I am this type of person. So obviously one of my key stories is I am a happy person. I am someone that's positive, but we tell these stories of ourselves. And then he has a fifth one, which I think is very interesting, which is our social self, which is how do we think other people perceive us? And that very much motivates us around things. So emotions like shame or pride are social emotions, which actually about helping us fit in with the group in a way and what is expected with us. And I think authenticity, when it loses sight of the social self, is where we're in problems. We lose sight of where we are, the context we're in, the social environment we're in, that we really, really get into problems with it. And so which self is it we're talking about? Well, we've got, we obviously ourselves are evolving. So whether we want to call that a stable hallucination, or we want to call it just an evolving self, that's going on. We've also got different selves in different environments. That would be subpersonality ideas. Which authentic one should we be? I'm quite a different Nick when I'm being a statistician than when I'm being a dad or a stepdad, and you wouldn't want to see me on the dance floor when music comes out, but I'm expressing a different part of myself there that may or may not be authentic, but there are different parts of ourselves. So who are we being authentic to? And then there is the fact that actually we've got these different parts of ourselves, which are, the one that's experiencing, the one that's laying down our narratives, and then our social self, which I think is, it's actually how do we fit in? I think that's a massively important part of it. So that was my little bit I wanted to say about selves and things. And Angela, thank you very much for putting some links in there. Dan, I'm going to go back to you, but I don't know also whether you've been looking at the comments, whether you want to pick up any of those.
Yeah, I would. Nick, I think you started to answer Michelle's question with how do we determine our true self? And so Anil Seth has a wonderful framework, but it is just a framework, right?
Yeah.
I think what's important is this phrase that Nick and I keep using, the evolving self. And funny enough, there's actually a book from the 1980s that's about on par in density with Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, called The Evolving Self by Robert Keegan. And Robert Keegan is someone who's dedicated his life to understanding adult development. And any of you who have taken Psychology 101 know that there's a tremendous amount of quality data on how we predictably develop over time throughout our childhood. Robert Keegan and his colleague Lisa Leahy at Harvard dedicated their entire academic life to trying to understand, well, is there any predictability to how we evolve as adults? Not childhood development, but includes child development. How do we keep evolving? And what they found was fascinating. I'm oversimplifying dramatically to try and answer this question of understanding. Well, then how do we understand who we really are? The stages of adult development almost comically start with the word egocentrism, which, look at where we live in the all-encompassing, everyone gets to see what everyone's thinking, social media time that we live right now. And you think about that for a moment. This first stage of adult development that all of us have to go through involves egocentrism. So what does egocentrism mean? It means I have a hard time seeing beyond my own experience. Therefore, I have a hard time really seeing, appreciating, and understanding the experience of other people. So what's the self after that? Let's say you've evolved, your self has changed. What happens next? Well, what happens next, first order of business, is that you really have come to appreciate and assimilate and understand the experiences other people are having. So what do? Just as Nick's saying, there's a social self, we start responding differently. So imagine your social response to people if you have a hard time seeing and appreciating their experience, their thoughts, their opinions, and versus the kind of response that would come out of you if you deeply appreciate and understand the experience and thoughts and feelings of another human being. What's beyond that? In a word, complexity. Once you move beyond that next socialized stage, the easiest word to describe that third stage of adult development would be complexity. You see the entanglements that human beings are in. You see the entanglements that society is in, and you become excited to get more information. So information suddenly is neither good nor bad. It's just complex. It just is. There are not so great things happening, and there are really great things happening simultaneously in an ecosystem. So how do all these things work together so that we can better design a more healthy, holistic, more humanistic ecosystem? And that's the third stage of adult development. So I want to pin this back to Michelle's really good question. How do we determine our true self? It depends on where you are. So if you think for a moment about what, if you were looking for any predictability, anything static in your sense of self, the only thing you could potentially grab a hold of, which would be up for an extraordinary debate, is your own awareness. Your awareness is the only thing that is persistent throughout your life, with a huge variability in what you may be aware of. So if by listening to Nick and I, you are suddenly aware that I have a hard time seeing other people's experiences, I have a hard time appreciating and understanding differing points of view, you are on a completely new path because of what you become self-aware of. So Michelle, the advice to you and others on the call that may be wrestling with this, as Nick and I have been wrestling with it, understanding and determining your truth self is A, dependent on where you are in the journey, and B, what you're aware of. It's you are in an evolution, whether you're aware of it or not, but you are much more in touch with the stage you're at and what your next steps may be and how you respond in the fluidity of social situations, for instance, by being self-aware. So the core of this is always going to come down to that. So again, I'll share you just one more bit about my morning coffee talk with Jules today. She had me with her first answer. So I said, oh wait, I've got more. And so I asked her, why do you think people are so committed to the idea of a static self? That I just am, this is me, I'm static, I'm fixed. We kind of create that illusion for ourselves at time, especially when we're defending ourselves. And I loved her answer. She said, it's comfortable to pretend we are fixed in order to have some sense of consistency. And you think about that for a second, in a world that is very unpredictable, out of our control, and a bit chaotic most of the time, that need we have out of our own survival and sense of safety, which Nick is going to talk about, and no wonder our mind would want this illusion that I just am, I'm fixed. And then she also said, in a succinct moment of brilliance, change is hard. Changing ourselves is very difficult, and unearthing uncomfortable truths is even harder. Speaking to that question of why do we end up trying to believe that we're more static? So I've started to kind of tap into maybe a little bit of safety, Nick. I would love to hand it back over to you to run with any of that narrative?
Yeah, I think safety, and I think I read something, Belinda saying it's sometimes difficult to be one's own self when you're in a workplace as you're working with colleagues that you would not always choose to be with normally. I think we all have that experience, and sometimes in different contexts too, if we volunteer, or if we or sometimes you can look at your teenage children and think, are you people I really want to be with sometimes, or whatever it is, and you can, so how do we still hold on to our values and who we are in those situations? And I guess that is the challenge of awareness and all sorts of things about that. I quite like this idea that awareness for me is, someone who's trained as a therapist, is the whole therapeutic process is a coming into awareness process. Is how do we become more aware, with the idea that we can have more choice. And in fact, actually Friday Pulse is exactly the same for an organization, is coming into awareness, how happy or unhappy are your teams, what are the things that people are doing well, what they aren't. It's putting that under your nose. And I think we all know that what we attend to is actually what gets dealt with. If we we can sometimes heroically avoid things in our personal lives and our professional lives. You just push it away because it's so. And most tools, I'm sure, like Michelle is talking about, feedback ones and things like that, they're all about actually how do we start talking about things sometimes which are quite difficult to talk about. So we were going back to me talking about safety, and I've got very interested. I think we see this across society at the moment, but we see it on Twitter debates, we see it everywhere. What we've got this freedom to be ourselves, or to freedom of speech. People will take a huge stand on against, or intention with, not against, safety. How do we, this is the whole debate I think that goes on about people in Britain at least call people who are thinking too much about safety as woke, and people who are like too much talking about freedom as sort of, I don't know, right wing, I don't know, something. And this tension is really there. And I think in our organizations, one of the troubles with authenticity is feeling like it goes right into the freedom of speech, freedom to say whatever I want to because I'm being true to myself, irrespective of who you are. And of course, there's something powerful sometimes about speaking up, especially if you're speaking up to bullies, or you're speaking up to to get into that power where you are, when you're outraged in some ways, you're actually putting your rage out, but you're basically talking from that position of power. It's not that you can never be angry, it's not that you can never be anything, but it's about how do you deal with the consequences of that. One of the things I always loved in my training was group therapy or group work, because there's no hiding in group work. In one-to-one therapy, you can start to run rings around your therapist and yourself if you want to. It's your money, you spent the hour. But in groups, people will just pick you up on things, and things will land differently than you expect, and land differently than you intended. The intention is often not to upset people. The intention might be to inquire into something like that, but it lands wrong. We had a classic case to that in the royal household, last week, with a much older woman asking someone of color, where they were from repeatedly. And of course it came across as, and is actually very racist, but maybe in her little mind, she was actually trying to be inquisitive. I mean, I don't know. It's a very narrow view of it. I'm not excusing her in any way, but people's intentions can be very different than how they land. And that's a learning process. And if you hold a value where you want to be respectful and include other people, then then that's something you learn away along, and bringing into awareness helps that. And this is again in praise of HR, really, in the sense that I think that HR and all sorts of other, by expressing their values and making them very visible and saying this is what we hold you to account for. Of course, organizations do this to varying degrees of success. They can have values that they've forgotten about. They can make some values, put them on the wall, and forget about them as soon as they leave the room. But if they really try to live their values, then actually, it gives something to touch. It actually makes everyone feel freer and safer. There's actually quite a bizarre thing that goes on, I think, when people don't know what the rules are. We actually feel unbounded, uncomfortable. We don't know what we do. Actually having some rules, like, actually, you need to speak to young people like this. If you're an older man, you talk to a younger woman like this. You don't talk to her like this, because that's going to make her feel uncomfortable. You're not meaning to. There's all sorts of things like that. And organizations are really good at actually bringing this down to micro actions and what we do. So I actually feel very optimistic about those sort of things. But clearly, when you don't have them, you have a Wild West scenario where anything goes, and that doesn't end well, and has not ended well in the fire department, in the Metropolitan Police, in the Parliament. And so I think we do need these boundaries. It's one of those ironic things. We need some boundaries for freedom, and safety to me is hugely, hugely important. So if you are making values for your organization, you have a value, something like be my true self, or be your authentic self, or be your best self. It's like, that does need to also be balanced by respect and ensuring safety, psychological safety for other people in and around there. So that's where and I wrote a blog on this, which is up on our website, about it last week. I actually started off trying to write to this title, authentic, and I ended up having a rant about bad behavior, and that's where my blog went. So that's what it became. That's how writing goes sometimes. But I think that's what it comes down to, is this tension, and it is a creative tension in lots of ways, because out of that emerges, I think, something around authenticity. If we can be authentically authentic, we can sort of reclaim the word. That was a bit of a thing. Have you got something to pick up here? I think you might be able to answer Michelle's question more, because I'd love you to talk a little bit about the tools that you use and you're trained in, Dan, because you've got a very different and much more one-to-one detailed idea about leadership and authenticity. And of course, there's probably 40,000 different articles on authentic leadership. But I know that you've got some thoughts about that, and I think it'd be good to get those in the last like 5-10 minutes.
I do. Thank you, Nick. What a beautiful handoff. I want to give you all a very concrete example of what Nick's talking about between safety and freedom to be yourself, from a real experience I've had as an executive coach at the chief executive level. I'm going to tell you about one person. This is one leader. And I would love to tell you that they, if you watched them in their home life and saw them in their personal lives, they are the most gracious and loving and kind parent and grandparent, child to aging, ailing parents that you would want to be inspired by. Just a beautiful soul. And yet at work, they are the most abrasive, belittling, blaming, throw under the bus at every opportunity kind of leader that I've personally ever encountered in 11 years of executive coaching. The level of dissonance that I'm proposing to you is not overstated. It's actually extraordinary. And so this brings up the question, well, of who is this person? How could this exist between two people? And what I mean to bring from concept to concrete is Nick's comment about safety and freedom. And so this executive was free to be themselves in the way that they felt they could best protect their self-image, the image they were trying to hold of themselves, which was perfect, never of wrongdoing. And that was the dysfunction. And that was the attachment to their identity. So they would be like terrible to other people in blaming, shaming, throwing under the bus, and belittling to uphold this false image they had of themselves. And, you could say, arguably, this version of them at home was probably the real version of who they are, where they felt the most safe because they didn't have to worry about their reputation. What a paradox that is. So, the level of safety you feel with little to no threat to your self-image and how you want to be seen by others, versus at the chief executive level of a very large company where everyone has eyes on you, that's very threatening, may predict how reactive you become. And the emotionally reactive version of you is not who you are. It's just a biochemical emotional reaction. So as Nick's saying, like drilling into this with people is really being a mirror to them and helping them understand which version of you is most productive for the situation. Because I can assure you with how things worked out for that executive, it didn't go well. They didn't meet their grandest goals by being so self-protective of their ego. Bringing this even into more concrete, I want to share with you the definition that I have personally come to love, and I've bothered Nick with it for months to get his thoughts on this. And then I'm going to give you some very practical, succinct questions and behaviors on what I believe is authentic leadership in the workplace, but it extends beyond the workplace. This is about life. So I'm going to bring my very brief slides back up with you again. So we covered the issues with authenticity. So the optimal definition, believe it or not, I question this, by the way. I would love to hear your thoughts if this is in fact an optimal definition. This is just me saying optimal, but it comes from existential philosophy, believe it or not. And if you Google the word authentic definition, you can find this on Google if you do the little drop down. It's relating to or denoting an emotionally appropriate, significant, purposive, and responsible mode of human life. And I think what's extraordinary about this definition is being authentic is in direct relationship to the situation and other people. Speaking directly to Nick's point about there's these multiple selves and we are only ourself in context to situations and relationships. So if we are to be emotionally appropriate, significant in how we respond to circumstance, purposive, and responsible in terms of human life, what an extraordinary way to define what we tend to call a value system. And instead of using words to describe our values, what if it were this kind of inquiry instead? And by inquiry, I literally mean this. Is your next act emotionally appropriate? And that could be in any of the randomness and chaotic of circumstances that you experience on a day-to-day basis, at work, at home, with your family, at networking, out in traffic, dealing with people at your favorite cafe or restaurant. You know, is your next act emotionally appropriate? It really tempers this natural reactive version of us that comes up that is not at all our true self. I like this one particularly for work, the next two particularly for work. Is your next act significant? Think of all of the times you spoke up in a meeting to get your thoughts out, but were they significant and purposive? I know I have said lots of things that were hot air in meetings because I felt like I needed to speak to protect my ego. And I wasn't at all thinking about this. I wasn't thinking about the significance of my contribution. I wasn't thinking about how purposeful my contribution was. I was just trying to contribute to establish some sense of equality in the room to satisfy my egocentrism. And we all do it, and it's all okay as long as we're contemplative about it and self-aware and thinking about it and learning from it so that our self can evolve. And then finally, of course, I mean, what a question for our time with the enormous global problems we are facing. Is your next act a responsible mode of human life? And you think about the dignity for humanity involved in that inquiry. So here's what I like, and I would love to know your thoughts about. Traditionally, we think of labeling exact words and trying to fit the chaos of life circumstances and all the situations we're going to face into that narrow framework of a word or 4 or 5 words that we called our value system. What if we change that to an inquiry? And my argument or thesis would be that if the only static thing we really have throughout time is our own self-awareness, self-awareness is grown through inquiry and lots of different forms of inquiry. So what if, hypothesis, we started asking ourselves these questions, rooted, of course, in my biased opinion about the existential philosophy definition of authentic or authenticity. Could we lead a little more effectively? Could we evolve more gracefully instead of being fixed or narrowed into those confusing circumstances to words that may not match if adaptability is required? And so one last thought on the practical leadership ideas. I picked a few things that I felt were real tangible examples in the workplace of trying to answer these questions and how they would just show up in the most ordinary of circumstances at work. And here's what I came up with. Meeting your commitments. I mean, I don't think I'm the only one that would argue we live in a time that overpromising and under-delivering on when we'll get things done or get back to people, things like that, is strained just by proxy of our attention being diffuse all the time. But meeting your commitments is truly authentic if you were thinking about those questions. Being emotionally grounded, you could say, is arguably authentic by way of that definition. Think of the amount of emotional reactivity we're experiencing in real life and online, even just given the collective trauma we have all been through geopolitically and with the coronavirus of the last couple of years. Like, it's extraordinary. So being emotionally grounded would fit this purposive, significant, emotionally appropriate way of living. Taking responsibility in your part in problems, I couldn't stress that one enough. It's amazing how much we shield ourselves from that out of fear of consequence at our own expense and to the expense of our teams and companies. Respecting others who you disagree with, managing conflict in such a way that multiple perspectives can be taken, that's complexity. So when I was mentioning that higher self, really embracing complexity, really taking on the perspectives of multiple people in the room, even if you think they're factually incorrect, is important in being authentic. Appreciating the totality of circumstances. You know, one of the most common emotionally reactive triggers I see in leadership in the workplace is that the news and the facts of what happened did not fit our desired outcome. And now we're off the rails, whatever that means emotionally for you. It depends on the severity of the circumstance. But if you can appreciate that complexity leads to most mistakes, that's a bit more of a responsible mode of human life. And of course, being humanistic in our cultures and workplace. And I love the shout out Nick gave to HR in their wonderfully critical role in workplace organizational culture and that humanism that gets brought to the workplace. And we need that tension. We need that tension between humanism and capitalism, and you can find it right there. And that's that tension between freedom and safety that we're experiencing too. Capitalism and humanistic, they have to work together, and there's an inherent tension there. So I would never claim this was an exhaustive list, of course. So the what else, you know, if you've got popcorn ideas, we'd love to see those in the chat because Nick and I are still going to be talking for years about this and what it really means. So Nick, I would love your thoughts. Audience, I would love your thoughts too.
My thoughts is that I sort of was nodding as I go along, and then there's quite a depth to it. So I don't know if that's what you mean, Michelle, by the granularity of language. I think you're talking about HR there, but I'm going to put all of these in a follow-up email because there's quite a lot in Dan's words there. So I will when we do the follow-up email, I will recreate those slides for you. So don't worry if you didn't get some of the words there. I really like the pragmatism about that, you know, grounding in those questions about what's my next action going to be, and thinking about it, as you say, in terms of, I mean, if we go in Anil Seth's word, it's the perceiving and the volitional self moving forward together. And maybe that's it. Maybe it's an alignment between all of those different selves he talks about. I'm quite obsessed with this book being used. One of the best books I've read over the last couple of years, and it might just be my own personal obsession rather than I'm giving it to my son, my poor son, for Christmas. He doesn't know, he's the doctor, he doesn't know what he's getting yet, but he won't be watching this, so that's okay. So look, we've got about 5 minutes left. I would love people to share, ask questions, ask Dan questions, but I'd also really appreciate it if, Angela, you could just pop up that. We just ask at the end of every webinar now for you to give us feedback in that NPS score. And I do take it seriously in that, you know, just looking how we're doing on each one, whether we've actually connected with you. I have we have tried to do some things slightly differently this time in order to respond to that. So I really appreciate that, whether you can answer that question, and then also if either in the chat or afterwards you give feedback about how we can improve these webinars. We do really want to, not that this one wasn't good, Dan, it was great, but it's like, but I mean, my problem is I can sometimes enjoy them and it doesn't actually land right. So I'm really interested in your things about what we can do. So has anyone got any questions for Dan or myself more about what we've been talking about all along? I think I come back to that there are these, you know, almost archetypal tensions, and one of them is, as I say, between safety and freedom, but also this idea of being in the moment and being able to access our emotional intelligence. You could call it, Barry Schwartz calls it practical wisdom, but, you know, actually, you know, making sure we respond in that way, which I really enjoyed from your things. Christine, it's called Being You by Anil Seth, A-N-I-L Seth, and it's on consciousness, really. It's a neuroscientific thing. There's some bits of it which get quite heavy, but I loved it, really, really loved it. And you can skip over the heavy bits if one needs to, but yeah. So
a question that's come in, Nick, Dan, what can organizations do to encourage employees to have more awareness of themselves and colleagues?
Brilliant. I love that question, whomever may ask. In a word, attunement. So borrowing from the psychological sciences, the word attunement would be the first step. So what does that mean? That means you are in awareness with accuracy and precision of what's going on in another person. So let's think of that as manager to employee. We all know what it's like to have a manager who's not attuned to us at all. Just there's objectives, period. And of course, there's objectives. Again, there's that kind of tension between capitalism and humanity that is just always present, right? So the balance of that between humanism and capitalism would be like, we have objectives that we have to meet, and your expectation and why you're paid is to meet those objectives. And as a manager, supervisor, or even peer-to-peer colleague, I'm making my best effort to really understand you, how your thought patterns work, how your habits work, how your emotions work. And I may just make little reflections along the way, being that mirror. So to make that even more practical, because I know I'm being kind of conceptual about it, having kind of that coaching posture toward people. Well, what do you mean by that? Oh, well, how do you define that word? You know, what makes you tick? You know, just asking, like using inquiry as a form of appreciative understanding. There's a whole psychological science actually called appreciative inquiry. And it is just being deeply interested in the other person's point of view, perspective, reference point, even if it's wildly inaccurate to the needs of the moment or off base, as most people would say. It's that effort and intention behind the questions you're asking that wakes someone up. So I'll give you an example of why this is so important. We have all been guilty of being asked a really good question where the answer to us is very obvious. And instead of answering the question right away, first we say, you know what, my wife or my husband or my partner or my brother has been telling me this for years. Like, you know exactly what they're asking about. And it's kind of pointing at something that's idiosyncratic about you. And a colleague or a boss or a coach asks you that question just the right way. And you say, that's what they've been talking about for years. That is exactly what I'm like. So inquiry, attunement, appreciation, staying present with somebody, even if they're rubbing you the wrong way, and making those bits of reflections and thoughtful questions to them can wake people up very quickly. But we often underestimate our power in that sense. So my encouragement to you is step into your power and asking really thoughtful, caring questions to other people, and they will slowly wake up.
Can I ask you a question, Dan? Is that, you got another one there, Angela? Or is that, can I
do, but you carry on.
Power. Organizations are power hierarchies. Authenticity, it's like, I think sometimes when we talk about authenticity, we think authentic leaders, we're thinking, but how, there's something gets messed up in hierarchies, isn't there? And there's, and power, and we haven't got time to explore it now, but I think there's something that undermines authenticity from that, where you sit in the power structure.
Yeah, well, power, I would love to respond briefly to that. In how I was describing the stages of adult development, the most extraordinary power I've seen in other people and the most extraordinary power I have felt in the workplace is in the moments where I'm actually emotionally independent of undesirable circumstances, meaning I'm literally not emotionally reacting, I'm not emotionally hijacked. And that has nothing to do with hierarchical power, which muddies the water around this. Hierarchical power naturally elicits fear and threat in our subconscious mind. So out of safety, we tend to be a little passive or aggressive in our emotional reactivity in hierarchical power structures. However, the most power I believe a human being can feel is being emotionally independent of circumstance, especially undesirable circumstance where you are emotionally grounded and well managed. That is an extraordinary power, because you are then free to choose how you respond to whatever that circumstance may be, which cuts through the hierarchical power structure.
I think it does it the best. And I think probably majority of people would struggle to find that power in their daily work and everything. But I think it's sort of making me think. I think most people know I'm working on a book at the moment, and I've got this very muddly area. It's called power, because how does power affect happiness? Well, I mean, I know all sorts of things, like people that are higher up the hierarchy tend to be happier than people lower down. That doesn't seem like rocket science, but we know all this data that came out of civil service that people lived longer up the hierarchy than did, so these inequalities matter. And I know I need to address it. I'm thinking about it at the moment. We really are at time, aren't we, Angela? I think I would like to thank everyone. I really enjoyed engaging with the chat. I enjoyed engaging with Dan very much, and we have done. I think we've deepened our relationship a lot, hasn't it, Dan? So that's very good. And we will not be having another webinar till the new year. So I'd like to wish everyone happy, Merry Christmas, whatever it is. It's just about okay to say that. I'm still not listening to Christmas tunes or anything. Are you listening to Christmas tunes yet, Angela?
No.
Yeah, maybe my next webinar should be about power, and I think I'll definitely put it down for the new year. I actually, my team want me to repeat or go back to some of the ones about engagement and happiness, but I will get to power next year, definitely. And I'm going to be quite a lot on LinkedIn asking questions, because I'm writing a book, and I really want people to would be very appreciative of engaging and giving me ideas, because I want to write a book that's helpful and slightly different in this area. So I don't want to regurgitate stuff. So please do connect with me and Dan on LinkedIn and have conversations with us going forward. We will send a follow-up to this, which you can watch the webinar again from that, and we will summarize it a bit too. Anything else I should say, Angela, before I say that?
No, so we'll send a follow-up email, as Nick said, with a link to this webinar, and so that you can rewatch it. And yeah, if you've got other questions, then please follow up with Nick and Dan via LinkedIn. And
any feedback on this one. But Dan, I'd really like to thank you. It's been a good conversation, and I've learned things, and I haven't thought about existential philosophy for quite some years, and when you came up with that thing, I thought, well, this is interesting. So it took me by surprise as we started this, but I've really thoroughly enjoyed the process of working with you. So thank you for that, indeed. And thank you, everyone, for joining. And the webinar series will be back in the new year. And if you want to know more about Friday Pulse, you know where to find us. I should be saying that it's supposed to be partly about awareness of our brand, bringing into awareness our brand, and Ensight Partners too, who do great work. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day, wherever you are.
Thank you all so much.